We're going to put together a video about things that the government might be hiding from you as a sort of sober take on some of the more plausible conspiracy theories. But having already done a list of things that the government actually did hide from us, it would have been kind of an underwhelming follow-up. And, for no good reason, there are plenty more disturbing and bizarre secrets that our governments would have preferred to keep quiet. Starting with number 10. Project Horizon. Back in the late 1950s, the US was lagging behind in the space race. In 1957, for example, the Soviets had launched Sputnik, the first man-made satellite, into orbit, and Eisenhower's America, it was crestfallen. Of course, it didn't help that many now saw the US as basically defenseless against a Russian nuclear strike. Their response? Well, they made plans to fire a nuke at the moon. We're really not making this up. It's easy to see this as kind of a geopolitical temper tantrum, a toddler throwing his toys at the wall. But for the Air Force, it was a PR device. Above all, it was a way to impress the world with the prowess of the United States. The flash of the detonation would be visible from Earth, said the experts, and because of the negligible lunar atmosphere, the dust would fly off in all directions, as opposed to the usual mushroom cloud shape. It would also leave a gaping lunar crater, forever changing the face of the moon. Ultimately, the plan was shelved. You probably knew that. We did not nuke the moon, but that was only because they came up with a better plan. Documents declassified in 2014 revealed plans to build a base on the moon. Outpost Horizon was to be a permanent, nuclear-powered and completely self-sustaining installation constructed by its inhabitants beneath the lunar surface. It would have airlocks, living quarters, dining and rec rooms, a hospital, science labs, and even storage for explosives. It was, in other words, dangerously ahead of its time. The 12 men expected to live up there by 1965 were to drink their own urine, grow plants in their poop, and look after chickens and fish. Also, if anyone lost their mind, there was a solitary confinement room for the complete isolation of psychiatric patients. The plan, though, it was finally abandoned when NASA took over the space program. Number 9. Acoustic Kitty. From missile-guided pigeons to mine-detecting dolphins, animals have long been co-opted for war. As retrograde as it sounds now, behavioral conditioning to this end was at the forefront of military research back in the 1960s. The IQ Zoo in Hot Springs, Arkansas was basically a front for such studies. On the one hand, it was a quirky visitor attraction, a place for the public to watch pigs playing the piano, chickens playing baseball, macaws riding bicycles, and reindeer operating a printing press. But on the other hand, it was a top-secret facility for training animal spies. Bug-planting ravens, mine-locating dogs, and the so-called Acoustic Kitty. The idea for the latter was hatched while visually surveilling a target. Since cats could be seen freely wandering in and out of the target strategy sessions, the CIA thought of bugging one in order to listen in. But simply attaching a microphone to the cat, it wouldn't do. Oh no. Instead, researchers transformed a cat into a $20 million radio transmitter. They ran a wire through the ear canal to instruments inside the rib cage and spiraled a super-thin antenna around the kitty's tail. Using ultrasound cues, they could also direct the cat's movements left, right, and straight on. Now, we don't actually know if this was ever deployed. The fate of the project is a bit murky. Some say the Acoustic Kitty was flattened by a taxi just seconds into its first field test. Others say that the implants were removed and the kitty lived a long and happy life. We prefer to believe the latter. The CIA, though, they refused to comment, although one declassified document does appear to suggest that the impractical project was cancelled. Anyway, now that we can eavesdrop with lasers, it's likely to be a thing of the past. Number 8. Mapimí Silent Zone. Usually when a country fires upon another, it's considered an act of war, but America's long-suffering neighbor to the south has been known to let it slide. On July the 11th, 1970, an Athena V-123D rocket was fired at New Mexico's White Sands missile range, but it overshot the target and it landed near Old Mexico's Bolson de Mapimí instead. This is actually an important ecosystem about 200 miles south of the border, so yeah, they missed by quite a lot. The cleanup operation, with the help of the Mexicans, was absolutely huge, requiring a brand new road just to get vehicles to the blast zone. Hundreds of tons of cobalt-57 contaminated soil had to be removed. This was the radioactive isotope that had been added to the bomb to maximize fallout and civilian casualties. Fortunately, the site had few, if any, humans, but the bomb could have hit just about anywhere. In a memo sent to Nixon, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger made it out to be an unforeseen blunder attributable to the missile's abnormal re-entry into the atmosphere. However, the Athena program had already been suspended in July of 1968 following 3 consecutive flight failures. Further, funding had been slashed between 1966 and 1969, forcing the Air Force to cut corners with the design. Although officials involved in the program expressed safety concerns, they presumptively reasoned that the public is willing to accept some risk if such tests appear necessary in the national interest. Far more than just an unforeseen blunder, the military allowed for such incidents. Indeed, it expected them. Nowadays, the blast site is known as the Mapimí Silent Zone, or sometimes the Mexican Bermuda Triangle. It may be no coincidence that its renown as a UFO hotspot outweighs any memory of American hubris. Number 7. 1968 Thule Air Base B-52 crash. In the previous video we made about this topic, we mentioned the 1961 Goldsboro B-52 crash, a potentially apocalyptic nuclear mishap that you would have thought America would have learned from. Apparently not, though. Almost 7 years later to the day, on January the 21st, 1968, another nuclear-armed bomber hit the dust, or snow in this case. And this time it happened on an overseas territory. The aircraft had been circling the Thule Air Base in northern Greenland as part of Operation Chrome Dome. These missions kept bombers on continuous airborne alert between 1960 and 1968, each of them on standby to go and annihilate Moscow if that was needed. A fire broke out in the navigator's compartment, and the plane lost electrical power and slammed into the ground just 7 miles away from the base. It actually slammed through the ground, blasting through the ice into the North Star Bay at a speed of 500 knots. 6 of the 7 crew ejected, and the aircraft was destroyed upon impact. Whatever was left was consumed by the fire of 200,000 pounds of jet fuel. The casings of its 4 1.1 megaton H-bombs were also destroyed, scattering tiny fragments of highly radioactive tritium and plutonium across the crash site. A major cleanup operation followed, involving scientists from Denmark and more than 70 federal agencies. And while the major general in charge downplayed the extent of the contamination, framing the incident as exciting and a classic example of international cooperation, many of those involved suffered ailments later on. Over the subsequent decades, hundreds of them contracted cancers, and of 500 Danes studied, only 20 were able to have children, several of which were born with deformities. The US did not even have express permission to be flying nukes over Danish territory, much less deploying them on the ground. So now the question becomes, after this second time, did the Air Force finally learn its lesson? Well, kinda. Nuclear weapons were removed from all planes on airborne alert in the immediate aftermath of the incident. After all, it wasn't just Goldsboro and Thule, there had been 8 other nuclear-armed crashes. More recently, however, there has been talk of a return to a Chrome Dome-style strategy. Number 6. 1953 Iranian coup d'etat. Historically, the US and UK have controlled oil supplies in the Middle East. The Arabian-American Oil Company owned Saudi Arabia's, and the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, now BP, owned Iran's. But all of that changed in 1950. When the US finally gave into pressure to start sharing revenue with the locals, Iran expected Britain to follow suit. When it didn't, the Iranian PM, Mohammad Mossadegh, simply nationalized his country's oil industry, depriving the UK of any share and securing, or so he thought, critical funding for his program of liberal reforms. In response, Britain conspired with the US to overthrow Mossadegh, the closest Iran has ever come to a truly democratic and socialist leader, and one who intended to abolish the monarchy. Although he saw the first attack coming and arrested those involved, the coup against him, it was ultimately successful. The status quo was restored and BP got a share of the oil. But such blatant interference by the US and the UK had earned them the nickname the Great Satan, and their 1953 coup d'etat, it paved the way for the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the devastating transformation of a once progressive nation into the fundamentalist nightmare that we see today. Number 5. British establishment pedophiles. In November of 2014, London's Metropolitan Police finally agreed to investigate historical claims of child sex abuse at the highest levels of government and, more famously, in the media. These claims are mostly concentrated on the 1970s and 1980s, at a time when senior police officers and politicians, including Margaret Thatcher, are alleged to have blocked all inquiries. But the evidence, it started to pile up in the shadows. According to a prominent member of Parliament, MP, in 2012, there is clear intelligence suggesting a powerful paedophile network linked to Parliament and Number 10. Indeed, one senior lawyer claims to have seen records of government funding for the Paedophile Information Exchange, a pro-paedophile activist group during the 1970s. Allegations from the victims are even more harrowing. Survivors claim to have been trafficked via care homes into violent orgies with high-ranking defense and intelligence officials, as well as MPs and other people within the British establishment. Even Prime Minister Ted Heath has been implicated. Allegedly, a number of children were also killed. One 12-year-old boy was raped and strangled by a Conservative MP, says a witness, and another boy, a 10-year-old, was deliberately run over by a car. This was apparently a display of his rapist's legal immunity. Of course, much of this has yet to be proven, but declassified documents do suggest that investigations were blocked. And while the Metropolitan Police have attempted to dismiss the claims, the Crown Prosecution Service admitted in 2015 that there was enough evidence to prosecute at least one of the accused, Lord Greville Jenner. However, the CPS refused to do so, citing his severe dementia and advanced age of 86. They said that this simply wouldn't be in the public interest. This is very ironic, considering that Jenner himself had, back in 1997, criticized the British justice system for letting a similarly demented 86-year-old Nazi war criminal off the hook, fuming, "I don't care what bloody age they are." Jenner died in 2015, and the public hearing for allegations against him has been scheduled for 2020. Other investigations into British establishment pedophiles are ongoing. Number 4. JTRIG and HSOC. In August of 2013, Brazilian journalist David Miranda was detained in the UK under Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act, but he wasn't suspected of terrorism. What security officials really wanted to know was how he knew so much about British surveillance programs as well as those of the NSA. Furthermore, by imposing the full 9 hours detention afforded them under the Terrorism Act, they hoped to send a warning to his husband, the British journalist Glenn Greenwald. It didn't work. Hours later, Greenwald released a statement of outraged defiance via The Guardian's website, knowing that GCHQ, Britain's state surveillance agency, would probably see it within minutes. The following year, he won the Public Service Pulitzer for bringing Edward Snowden's NSA/Five Eyes revelations to light. Thanks to Greenwald, Miranda, and of course Snowden, as well as some others, most of us are by now at least dimly aware that our governments are spying on us all. But their fear of the internet, and hence their need to control it, goes deeper than mass surveillance. The Joint Threat Research Intelligence Group, JTRIG, is a unit within GCHQ whose aim it is to sow discord and disinformation online. It seeks to influence or game online interactions, for example forums and comment sections, by applying theories of compliance and trust. In other words, it employs an army of trolls. Its partner in crime is the Human Sciences Operations Cell, HSOC, whose agents apparently refer to themselves as magicians of persuasion. Unnervingly, JTRIG also targets individuals, but these targets needn't be criminals or terrorists, investigative journalists, political activists, and other inconvenient civilian subtypes who, by virtue of their legal innocence, aren't rightly out of reach of law enforcement, but they can find their reputations and their livelihoods suddenly destroyed by vicious rumors spread online or sent to their smartphone contacts. As we know, though, this happens all the time, and not just in Britain. These tactics are shared between each of the Five Eyes surveillance agencies: the UK, the US, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Number 3. Project MKUltra. During the 1950s and 1960s, LSD was revolutionizing psychotherapy, just as it probably will again. Hollywood stars like Cary Grant and Esther Williams attributed life-changing revolutions, the overcoming of addictions and the processing of childhood trauma, to LSD-assisted therapy. Breakthroughs expected to take years were happening within just a few hours. As Grant put it in an interview with Look magazine in 1959, "At last, I'm close to happiness." But the CIA, they were more interested in weaponizing the psychedelic. Documents declassified in 1975 revealed a 20-year-long, 1953 to 1973, human experiment project exploring, among other things, whether LSD could be used for mind control. Specifically, they wanted to be able to program people to carry out missions, or as the CIA put it, do our bidding, against their will and without any regard for their own survival. Only rarely did participants consent, and even then they were not fully informed. Electroshocks, sensory deprivation, and neurosurgery were also explored, and those subjected to the tests included prisoners, medical professionals, cancer patients, prostitutes, children, and animals. In the 1960s, for instance, the CIA successfully made remote-controlled dogs. Of course, it's hardly possible to go into much detail here, not least because Director of the CIA Richard Helms burned most of the records back in 1973, and the fact that only 20,000 documents remain as a fraction of the original archive gives us a sense of this project's scale. But what's interesting is that MKUltra began the very same year that America adopted the Nuremberg Code. This is an international standard for research ethics that emphasized the need for informed consent, and it was expressly worded to prevent any repeat of Nazi-style human experimentation. Number 2. Operation Cauldron. During the Cold War, the British were taught to fear the Soviets, but their own governments, it was more of a threat. Between 1953 and 1964, the UK's Chemical Biological Warfare Research Unit, Porton Down, released 4,600 kilos of zinc-cadmium sulfide, a potential carcinogen, from aircraft, ships, and trucks onto civilian populations in Wiltshire, Bedfordshire, and Norfolk. Then, in 1964, they released Bacillus globigi, linked to food poisoning, eye infections, and sepsis, into the London Underground. They wanted to see how rapidly it spread through the tube network. Some might say that the scientists weren't aware of the risks and that research in those days was lacking, but a number of them, they had grave misgivings about conducting the field tests. Further, none of them would have had any doubt whatsoever about the toxicity of the Black Death, which they released off the coast of Scotland in 1952. The test staked the lives of thousands of Hebridean islanders on the plague being blown out to sea. This was irresponsible enough, but when a fishing vessel unexpectedly appeared and passed through the cloud of live bacteria, the government's response was even more disturbing. Instead of alerting and quarantining the trawler, they allowed it to dock on the mainland. In other words, Churchill's post-war government was more prepared to risk an outbreak of plague than come clean about having released it. As it turned out, the fishermen hadn't caught the Black Death, but they had been affected by a number of other agents that were leaking from the tanker that spread it. This led to hair loss for at least one of them, and we all know how devastating that can be. The government didn't learn from the test. After burning all but one of the documents pertaining to it, they simply relocated their research overseas. Churchill personally approved a plan to test bioweapons in the colonies. Bahamians were subjected to encephalomyelitis, a cause of fever, fatigue, and even death, and Nigerians were subjected to nerve gas. More than 14,000 British troops were also experimented on between 1945 and 1989. The British military is now thought to have carried out more than 30,000 secret tests and largely done away with the evidence. Number 1. Operation Gladio. After World War II, with the threat of Soviet expansion looming, the US and UK-led NATO set up a network of secret armies throughout Europe. Modeled on the guerrilla resistance movements of the war years, these groups were totally unaccountable to citizens and even unknown to governments. In fact, it wasn't until 1990 that the European Parliament formally exposed and objected to their existence. Their job was to undermine the communists at all costs, and to keep doing so even if the communists won. However, the communists, they weren't all that disliked. The Italian Communist Party, for instance, was a valued part of the mainstream, despite US efforts to destroy it. If Operation Gladio was to uphold capitalism in Europe, therefore, it had to make people hate communism. And in order to do this, it had to recruit the people who hated communism in the first place, and that was Nazis. NATO's illegal foot soldiers carried out terrorist attacks across the continent and blamed them on the USSR. Civilians, including children, were brutally murdered at random, including at the 1980s Oktoberfest in Munich. It had to be at random, and it had to involve children so that nobody felt safe. Eventually, NATO assumed everyone would be so afraid of the commies that they would eagerly support previously unthinkable infringements of their hard-won civil liberties, such as mass surveillance. It was unusual for the perpetrators to survive these attacks, or if they did, they'd be unavailable for questioning. However, in 1984, the neo-fascist Gladio operative Vincenzo Viceguerra was brought to trial for a car bomb 12 years earlier. He freely admitted his guilt and said that he was under the protection of NATO, and furthermore, that he was one of its many operatives. Among the few people to actually believe him was the judge Felice Casson, whose subsequent digging around revealed NATO's strategy of tension. This involved the execution of false flag terror attacks and to blame them on fabricated enemies. The idea was that the masses would be paralyzed with fear and they'd consent to just about anything: mass surveillance, foreign wars, whatever. This strategy of tension was also behind Operation Northwoods, which was something we mentioned in our previous video. There's also absolutely no reason to believe this has been taken off the table today, it's just that the enemies have changed. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please give us a thumbs up below. Do not forget to subscribe. We've got brand new videos just like this every day of the week. I also do another channel where I do daily videos. It's called Today I Found Out. You'll find that linked to below. And as always, thank you for watching.